Good evening and welcome to the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuen Campus in Hong Kong for the second program of our new fall Yuen Lecture Series titled Hong Kong Redux. My name is Mark Barnekow and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuen Campus in Hong Kong, the university's premier location in Asia, representing our values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. We hope this Hong Kong Redux series will help our audience appreciate the history of Hong Kong and how the historical arts, literature, and culture of this great global city evolved. We're taking a unique approach tonight we hope you enjoy. We'll be streaming tonight's event, which was pre-recorded with English and Chinese subtitles on the UChicago Yuen Campus 2 weeks ago via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Professor Wong and I will then join you live after the recorded event so he can take your questions. Just a quick reminder to audience members, you can submit your questions through the questions and answer tab anytime during the event by first registering on Zoom. We'll be sharing one more very interesting surprise Hong Kong Redux program around the second week of December. For more information about that program and other news and Yuen Campus event listings, please check out our website at www.uchicago.hk or follow the UChicago Yuen Campus Facebook page for all the details. And finally, by visiting our UChicago Yuen Campus website, you can now register to visit the Yuen Campus to see the Hong Kong Impressions exhibit in small groups of 4, as well as our new exhibit, 100 Years of Women's Suffrage in America, in partnership with the US Consulate in Hong Kong and Macau. It's a wonderful exhibit, and I hope you can register on our webpage and visit the campus soon. We'll start the program now and be back afterwards for the Q&A with Professor Wong. Professor Wucius Wong, welcome to the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuen Campus in Hong Kong. We're delighted to have you here. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to the audience. Professor Wong has his bachelor's in fine arts and master's in fine arts from the Maryland Institute College of Design in Baltimore. Professor Wucius Wong was born in 1936 in Guangdong Province, China. He worked as an assistant curator at the City Museum and Art Gallery, and principal lecturer at the School of Design of the Hong Kong Polytechnic from 1967 to 1984. He received the John D. Rockefeller Fund grant in 1971 and the Emeritus Fellowship of the Hong Kong Arts Development Council in 1998. The Hong Kong Museum of Art presented its retrospective exhibition in 2006, and the Hong Kong SAR government honored him with the Bronze Kohina Star Medal in 2007. He's also the only visual artist honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Hong Kong Arts Development Council in 2016, which is the top award from the council. He's currently adjunct professor of Fine Arts Department of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, expert advisor to the Leisure and Culture Department, committee member of the Chinese Painting Institute in Beijing, and founding chairman of the Chinese Painting Institute in Hong Kong. He concentrates on creating ink paintings, which have been widely collected by museums in Hong Kong and across China, Europe, America, and Australia. Once again, welcome, Professor Wong.
Thank you. The honor is mine.
As a bit of background to this program, I'd just like to say that we are collaborating at the University of Chicago with the Chinese University of Hong Kong to bring the exhibit we have on the wall behind us, which we call Hong Kong Impressions. We've created this incredible catalog of many of the artists and the art and a lot of detail with special articles by curators and the director of the Chinese University of Hong Kong Art Museum. It's an incredible catalog, and I encourage you all to pick it up. And Hong Kong Impressions is actually a part of a program that we have here at the University of Chicago Yuen Campus called Hong Kong Impressions, which really is a look back at Hong Kong in the period of the 1950s, the 1960s, and somewhat in the 1970s. So my first question for you, Professor Wong, is you were born in Dongguan, Guangzhou province. How did you initially come to Hong Kong?
Oh, actually, my father was working in Hong Kong all the time after the war. So I was brought to Hong Kong as a baby to join my father in Hong Kong.
What was his job when he was in Hong Kong?
Oh, he worked with the Wing company, which is still there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Fascinating. And you were a young man in the 1950s, which our Hong Kong Redux program is built around. Can you describe the cultural and the artistic environment and atmosphere of Hong Kong during the 1950s? What was Hong Kong really like in the 1950s?
Oh, at that time, because of the turmoil inside China with civil wars, Hong Kong became a shelter for many of the Chinese who was able to come to Hong Kong to get away from all the turmoils. Then at that time, Hong Kong, because we were all able to work in a proper way, then Hong Kong gets prosperous because of that, because of people coming from China with money and talents.
And so many of the artists of that time
Also
brought their talents with them, and that created this new cultural environment in Hong Kong.
Before that, Hong Kong was really not very much, though. Before the war, Hong Kong was still really like a fishing port, just allowing goods from Europe to be imported to China. But after the war, then Hong Kong increased in population immensely. So in that way, then Hong Kong, in a short space of time, developed becoming an international kind of city.
It's fascinating that you mentioned that the population increased so much. From the data that I've seen, in the mid to late 1940s, there were about 600,000 people in Hong Kong at the time. And by the early 1950s, there were close to 2 million. And it increased, the population increased very rapidly after that.
Yeah, actually, after the war or before the war, there's really no particular immigration system stopping people moving from China to Hong Kong. The movement of people down to Hong Kong allowed Hong Kong to grow in great proportions of our population.
So there effectively was no border, and people came and went.
There was no border check at all.
Yeah, which is amazing compared to the first time I arrived in Hong Kong and went to Shenzhen. There was a border in 1981.
Oh,
and,
sure, of course, later.
I still walked across it, but there was a border.
The situation becomes unmanageable. So that's why both China and Hong Kong installed border checks So people later moving to Hong Kong, we have to smuggle.
Right. Well, one thing I learned about you that I didn't know before, when I lived in the States, I knew your name as this great artist in Hong Kong, ink artist in Hong Kong, but I didn't know that you started out as a poet and as a writer.
Yeah, I grew up in Hong Kong and went to English-speaking school in the early 50s. Then at that time, then I was exposed to various influences. Then I always saw myself as an eyewitness of the development of Hong Kong after the war.
But then you shifted gears. So I'm really curious what caused that transition between poetry and literature and writing and the shift toward art and painting.
Actually, when I went to the St. Joseph College, which is still there in Hong Kong, there were no art teaching at all. So my father died early, but he left a lot of books at home, and I was able to study or read most of the books that give me a background in literature. So I was very interested in poetry at that time. At the same time, I also read post-war poetry that included such great poets as T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. So I was exposed to modern poetry very early. And that also helped me to look into modern art at the same time.
Would you say that Western poetry influenced you more than ancient Chinese poetry at that time?
Both, yeah. But I started with Chinese poetry first, of course. But then I was also very curious of what modernism is about. So at first I read romantic poems that included Byron, Keats, and Shelley. But then I was more attracted later to modern poetry by T.S. Eliot and Auden particularly.
And did you find art and painting on your own? Or I know that you were a student of Liu Shuquan, who's very, very famous ink painter who was here in Hong Kong. Did you find him first, or did you find art and painting first?
I better say this, I have actually a mind of examining myself as what I want to do and what I could do and what I was allowed to do. In that way, that I wanted to become a poet and writer, and I also saw that I might not be able to develop too far because of language problems. The language problem is that in Hong Kong, I still am Cantonese speaking. That's quite different from Mandarin speaking. Then whatever is written in words is based on the Mandarin dialect. So in that way, then I found frustration. Actually, the at that time, the situation in Hong Kong is, if I write, I need publications. I need to have a magazine and newspaper to publish. Otherwise, I won't get known at all, you see. But I still wanted to become a poet. Then I used my own savings and get a few friends to do our own publications.
Which is an amazing
That
story.
started my literary career.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
I was known more as a writer and poet to begin with. But I found a frustration with the written language, with the written Chinese language. And then books in Hong Kong are also rare. It's not easy for me to read some Chinese books that from the Republican Chinese Times. So I know that I may not be able to develop fully as a poet and writer. Then I found that I have some inborn talents of doing drawing. Then I joined the Hong Kong Art Club and began to develop myself as a self-taught artist. Some of the works here belong to that period before I met Quaint.
I see. And so these paintings that we have on the wall here are from 1957 and 1958. Was that around the time?
Earlier than that.
Even earlier than
Earlier.
that. About what year did you start? Did you move from poetry to painting?
That's about 1957. I began to join the Hong Kong Art Club, and then with my knowledge and some inborn skills, I was able to get some reputation in the art world there then. So in that way, then I found myself getting a lot of progress very easily as a young artist.
And are these works very typical of that period for you? Because there seems to be a lot of experimentation in, in brushstrokes and in colors and in technique, and also like the two paintings behind me here, very observational about the environment around you and people playing mahjong or shopping on the street. Was that the kind of subject matter that you were mostly pursuing at that time to develop your art?
At that time, you see, in Hong Kong, my exposure was limited by what magazines and books and exhibitions and artists working there. These will limit my vision. But then I thought the way for me to develop as an artist probably is to absorb more of the modern movement in Europe and America. So I started to do my own drawing and painting without following any teacher. Then I was able to gain some progress and was able to sell some work as well. That gave me a lot of encouragement.
So you were actually able to sell your works back then?
yeah, I was able to sell some.
So you must have been perceived as a very talented artist, even as a young person, even as a young man.
Because I found that I could become a rather unique artist
Mhm.
at that time by absorbing some Western influence. So at that time, I was also very ambitious to move on and organize a very large exhibition. We called it the first Hong Kong Salon of Paintings by bringing in modern style work from Taiwan and Singapore and elsewhere.
This painting over my left shoulder, I believe it's called Back Alley, we can check that, really starts to demonstrate more of an abstract form. So you were already absorbing and experimenting with abstraction
Yeah,
at that period in time.
actually, because I was completely self-taught to start with.
Mhm.
So I use a palette knife that's normally used for oil painting to scrape lines and planes for my landscapes. And because at that time I have seen Cubist work, so I'm also very interested in geometric shapes as well.
Mhm.
So with that type of painting, then I was able to get quite well known
Mhm.
as a young artist without proper training.
Mhm. So before we talk about your more recent artistic practice, I'd like to talk to you about your relationship with your teacher, Liu Shuquan, and other artists from Hong Kong in the 1950s who may have influenced some of your thinking and some of your work, some of your painting.
Before I met Liu Shuquan, I studied with another Chinese painter from Guangdong. He was in Hong Kong at that time, and I studied traditional Chinese painting with him for about a year or so. Then his teaching seemed to be too old-fashioned.
Mm.
He gave me his own work for me to imitate. Then anyway, I did learn some of the basic traditional ink painting techniques. Then later on, I saw a small advertisement on newspaper from Mr. Lui. He wanted to establish a studio with teaching students. So I went to see him and became his student for about 2 years.
And what was your greatest learning from studying with Liu Shuquan? What did he teach you the most?
But Liu Shuquan at that time was exploring new avenues with Chinese painting, but he did have a very solid Chinese traditional painting background. So I went to see him and became his private student, probably the earliest, in his own studio, in a one-to-one situation. Then he gave me some reproductions of Chinese painting of Song and Yuan periods for me to copy but he also introduced me to the murals of the Dunhuang cave, and I copied that as well. So in that way, then I gradually developed my own style with the traditional brushwork.
Was he strong in encouraging you to develop your own style?
Yes, sure,
Yeah.
because he is doing that himself.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why I like him, and I feel that I could stay with him for some time to learn these traditional techniques.
So I have this belief as part of our whole Hong Kong Redux series that Hong Kong, the culture of Hong Kong was about innovation and taking culture in new directions. And so you ended up going off to the US and studying in the US and working in the US.
Right.
And many people may not know that you actually brought together your background as a writer and as an artist to write many books. You were very prolific in writing books on design.
I saw myself as a great ambition and wanted to learn a lot of different things. You see, I wanted to become a poet, but then I feel that I may not become a great poet because of my deficiencies. So I used the word deficiency to describe myself, that I'm not really good at all the things I want to do, but I can have absorbed a lot of things to help me to mix them to develop myself in a unique direction. And this is how I became able to find my own path.
And you brought many of those design elements into your art.
Because I am really kind of, I have the tendency to think in a logical, systematic way. And in that way, then I would examine myself as what I can do and what I can best do and what I cannot do and what I should do and how I can move on with what I can do. You see, this I probably was also influenced by Western philosophers such as Descartes, helping me to think systematically and also to choose widely from numerous different directions and examine some directions to choose the best one for myself.
But you're describing a characteristic which I find in great people and great artists, which is this internal desire and to pursue the things that interest you intellectually.
So I tend to think very intellectually, you see. The difference between me and Mr. Lui is that Mr. Lui is fully confident in himself. I'm the kind of artist or writer or something that I don't trust that I have the ability to master. So I have a theory of deficiency that in that way that I cannot do it, but instead another way that would enable me to do it. You see, tend to examine all the different paths and choose whether A is good or B is good, and whether A has A1 or A2 or A3, and whether I can mix A1 with B1 or C1. You see, this is my way of thinking.
Mhm.
You see, and I follow Wucius, and I actually have in mind that I will learn from him what I wanted to learn, but I would avoid his style if I could.
It's another characteristic of great people that who achieve
Uh,
is that they feel like maybe they're deficient in some areas and they have to make up for the deficiency.
yeah.
Now
yes,
you were in the States in the late 60s, 1970s. That was a really amazing experimental period for artists. I'm just curious, how did being in the US influence your art during the 60s and 1970s?
I know my direction. So at that time when I learned from Wucius, then I know that I must have to also go abroad to learn from the West at first hand. I thought that's very important for me. So after a while, then I begin to apply to art schools in America. And then I was able to get accepted, and I went to Columbus College of Design first, and later Maryland Institute.
So you had this incredibly vibrant environment for art in Hong Kong. You had a great teacher in Liu Shuquan. You went to the States and you studied art in the States. And so you had so many elements that fed into your art. What would you say if we zoomed out and looked at your art over the course of the arc of your career? What would you say is your greatest innovation or contribution?
I suppose you see, in America, I was exposed to Bauhaus teaching, and that actually is a very important turn for me to develop my systematic thinking, seeking for all solutions and choose the best or choose the mixture for me to move on. You see, actually from the very first point, inside my mind, I didn't want to learn from Wucius at all, except through him, traditional Chinese brushwork. You see, he's very different from me.
Yeah.
He's a masculine, and I'm not. You see, his work has the full force of masculinity that I lack completely.
Now your art took on a whole new definition when you started painting water. When did you start the process of painting water, and what does that painting of water actually mean to you as an artist?
Now, in Hong Kong, you have the mountain, but that is not the Great Mountain. So we look into the ocean a lot more, the harbor joining the Pacific. Then I was born on the edge of the Pearl River. So I thought I was more like the river flowing from the Greek source down to the ocean and abroad to the west coast of America, and then across the huge continent to the East Coast. You see, this is in a way that I started with the feeling of rootlessness.
Mhm. Hong
Hong Kong is really where I should belong.
Mhm.
But inside my heart, I find no roots at all.
Mhm.
I've never seen China properly until well after the Cultural Revolution inside China.
Well, that kind of leads me to my last question. You know, this whole idea of wandering and not feeling like you have roots. Now we're in this period of COVID-19. And I know from my own experience, like art is very important to me when I'm going through periods of difficulty. What can you advise the audience today in terms of how to deal with this incredibly difficult time in their lives and how it relates to art and the artistic practice?
I think when I stand before my students, I saw the great divide because we are really like half a century apart in most ways of thinking.
Mhm.
So what they can do is that they should establish their roots in a proper way. You see, in Hong Kong, I'm probably the only artist who can speak with traditionalists and the avant-gardes, because I had both in my own background.
Mhm.
The avant-garde part was what I learned in America, but I stayed with my traditional background as well. And I also saw myself as I was born in Wumen, which is the tiger's mouth. It's a small town at the on the edge of the Pearl River, very close to Hong Kong. And Wumen is the place where the opium was dumped. So, and that becomes the story, the beginning of the story of how Hong Kong became from a small fishing island to an international city.
Well, that's a very interesting evolution of Hong Kong, and it's fascinating.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, but it's also fascinating to hear about Hong Kong's evolution and your own personal journey as such a great artist that you are. So I want to thank you for joining me today and joining everyone here on the Yuen campus in Hong Kong. It's been a pleasure. I'm so delighted and honored to meet you, and I'm sure our audience has many questions for you, and look forward to having you answer some of those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Wong, it's so nice to see you tonight.
My pleasure to meet you here. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing a little bit about your life and your artistic career. I know some of the audience members tonight had a few questions they wanted to ask you.
Okay.
And the first question, everybody wants to know what you're doing with your creative life now during COVID-19.
My creative life is rather complicated because I have a wide range of different interests, and I try to move on to new directions if I could. And So in my artwork, then I probably change my direction every 10 years. Then, of course, I was interested in literature, and that is the permanent background for my work. Literature helps me to convey my emotions. So if I paint a mountain, then the mountain would deliver some of my emotions. I hope if I could.
Are you doing more reading currently, reading of literature during the COVID period, or are you still painting?
I'm still doing some painting. At this time, because of the pandemic, I rarely go to my studio to do large size paintings. So I would use a spare bedroom to do smaller work here. Then I'm still hoping to get a breakthrough. That means to do something which was not attempted before. So this is my ambition, just to keep going on and try to see new directions within my capacity.
It seems to me, from my knowledge, that Chinese ink painters strive to have new breakthroughs as they age, as they get older in their career. Is that true for you?
Actually, most Chinese painters accomplish more in the old age rather than when he or she was young.
That's a good point. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because at an older age, then my ability to control the blush increases with time. So most Chinese artists probably would seek to do a painting with less brush strokes, but I haven't been able to do that yet.
I see.
I had a style generally with complicated compositions. So I'm hoping to go a more simplified path for my development at this time. I haven't done that yet.
I see. It's something to keep striving for, and it's just really amazing to see Chinese artists continue to strive for new innovation and reaching new heights.
Yes, most Chinese artists will reach the zenith at an old age, not at a younger age. So I thought I may have the chance to do something different from before. But because of the pandemic, then I'm not really too happy, in a small studio, which is a spare bedroom here.
I totally understand, and I think many people watching this program and many people who will watch the recording in the future feel the same way. We have to support each other now.
Yeah. So people also may wonder, why, I have the different style directions. It's because I was involved in literature and design. I've never been a professional designer, but I have written several books on design, which have been bestsellers for quite a number of years, and is still on the bookshelf with translations in different European languages.
Which is remarkable, really, in this day and age, that your books are still on the shelves. That's really
That's
amazing.
still on the shelf.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
actually, the books were written as early as 1970s. You see,
Does that mean that design hasn't changed that much, or were your design books more about the fundamentals of design?
no, I was able to grasp the rules of how to produce a composition.
I'm sure many design students in Hong Kong and around Asia will now probably drive up your sales of your design books. They'll probably go out and look for them. So hopefully that happens. One of the audience members had a question about whether the Chinese spirit is a major, indispensable element in Chinese ink painting, the Chinese spirit. Is that something you can comment on?
Yes, I think if for Chinese ink painting, it's really like joy in the Western culture. We started with a blank sheet of paper, which is white generally. You see, then every stroke will be added to the surface, which cannot be changed, will remain permanent. And generally speaking, we rarely use white paint to cover up any of the mistakes, but we try to make the mistakes work as part of the painting, you see. So the Chinese spirit is also conveyed in the use of the brush, which is a conical shape. It's different from a brush for oil painting, which is has a squarish tip. So
That is what
because
is amazing about Chinese painting is you only get one chance to get it right. You can't cover up your mistakes.
they
That
use white paper and add black or gray brush strokes to it. Then we might add color to it, but that is not the mainstream of Chinese painting, though. Chinese painting, because it has long been used as an expression of the heart by the literati, the learned scholars. So it's not meant to be a commodity for sale in most cases. So I try to stick with the Chinese tradition in order to be able to develop a way that's different from the Western approach, because I was rather aware of the dominance of the Western culture in the 20th century.
Mhm.
So we absorb the foreign influences. Hopefully, we want to use those influences as fully integrated with the Chinese spirit.
Hmm.
Mm.
I'm curious, do you consider yourself a literati artist?
I do, yes, because of particularly I have a background in literature, but in another way, very different from most Chinese artists because I learned design. I never practiced design as a professional designer,
Mhm.
but I have been teaching design for many years. And in that way, then I become a theorist. That means I know the particular ways of how to make a composition look good. So in my design books, I produce different principles to help the readers or the students to use those principles to achieve a nice looking composition.
Hmm.
And I believe my design books have been a good seller because it's very effective for teaching students. And students, in my experience, normally get excited with my problems and became willingly to spend hours and hours to do the exercises by hand. Because years ago, the computer was not available. So every shape has to be hand painted. Yeah. So in that way, I was actually once have a reputation of a design books author. People know my name more from the books than my paintings, because my paintings do not have a very wide appeal to collectors, because it is not Chinese enough and not westernized enough for their understanding and preference.
But I think you say that as a true literati artist, very humbly. I certainly knew about your work living in California and San Francisco. You're very world renowned. So I think you're also a humble man. And I think that's also a special part of the Chinese spirit. One of the questions came in Chinese. Speaking of that, you never heard me ask a question in Chinese. Let me try it out and see how it goes. The question is, 水墨未来发展如何保存传统吗?
What's that?
So the question is ink art, the future of ink art development, is that going to be preserved? The tradition of it going to be preserved?
I want to continue developing with the Chinese painting tradition. That's the only way China can maintain a unique image of the country for contribution to the world, and not as a follower of what the Westerner has been doing. So I'm ambitious in that way, hoping to try different ways of using the brush, of composing the picture, of expressing the emotions without with denial of my tradition.
What would you recommend
don't-
to students today who want to learn ink painting? What would you recommend for them to get started and to evolve their practice?
I suppose everyone pursuing Chinese painting still have to do a lot of drawing in the Western manner, because now we are in a different world than we are exposed to so many different ways of life and thoughts.
Do you, how do you feel about the evolution of the Chinese art market, the market as a whole? Is that something that you're discouraged by? Is it something that you're excited about? How do you feel about the market? Professor Wong, I think you muted yourself. I'm not sure if we can fix that problem. I think Professor Wong clicked mute by accident. Maybe his wife, Pansy, can help on the side there. Professor Wong, we can't hear you. We can't hear you because you pressed the mute button. So unless we can fix that. I have to say, while Professor Wong is trying to unmute himself, we did a dry run of this program on Monday, and it was the first time for him to use Zoom and we're using a product called StreamYard to try to make things a little bit easier for the program for Professor Wong to join us. But I think we are having difficulties with the sound. So I'll tell you what, Professor Wong, I want to thank you for joining us. We can't hear you now, but I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you spent the time with us on this program. I want to say goodbye to you now. And again, we appreciate you sharing with our audience and joining us live after the recorded event. It was a really special event for us. I'd also like to thank Josh Yu, the director of the Art Museum at Chinese University of Hong Kong, who's been really a great collaborator on this project. He brought Professor Wong together with the University of Chicago and myself and our team. And I really want to thank Josh for making all that happen. We'll finish the program tonight with a short continuation of our conversation and look more closely at Professor Wong's work from the exhibit. Thank you all for joining and watching this program this evening, and we'll see you next time. Maybe when you donated it to the university,
Yeah, yes,
it says 2006年
yeah.
on it, and this one 19.
The inscriptions were done much later.
Done later, right?
Yeah, because actually when I have them, it was not signed at all.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
I remember that when we use oil painting, we probably don't get good canvas and the best oil paints that are available, such as cadmium orange, which is very expensive. You may not be able to get it then.
Did you paint much on canvas or almost exclusively
I did
on
paint some, but
somewhere?
I prefer the water media.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Why do you like water?
I suppose.
Do you grind your own ink too?
First of all, it's easily available, it's cheaper, and it's also portable.
These were done indoors.
But all those are on site, I think.
Oh, okay.
Those are indoors. But these are, that particularly is outdoor sketching.
Was there a particular island you really enjoyed painting?
Chongqiao.
Chongqiao. That's a nice one.
Chongqiao is very nice.
Yeah. Maybe look at these paintings as well. No, this site is spectacular.
That's my home. You see.
Oh, it is?
I grew up, always saw my mother doing mahjong
Oh, really?
with her friends. And that is really an actual drawing of what I saw. You see, that's a calendar, and that is a piece of furniture
Right.
with a glass.
And what about this one? I'm always curious about this one. Just even the brush strokes are different from painting to painting, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, these are probably also outdoor sketching directly in front of the scene.
Well, I think that we're finished for today, they're telling me. We're finished.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.